Welcome everyone to this roundtable discussion on Belt and Road as Method. Our subtitle is Forging Theoretical Agendas. The event is organized by the Max Weber Foundation Research Group. It's a research group on borders, mobilities, and new infrastructures here in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at NUS. It's a relatively small research group with currently two postdocs that's been running since 2017. But the event is of course hosted and co-organized with the Asia Research Institute. And so can I just begin very briefly by thanking the ever-efficient ARI Secretariat for helping with the organization of the event. The event is a prequel to something else that's happening hosted by ARI next week. And that is next week's third China-made workshop on the social life of Chinese infrastructures in Southeast Asia. So please take a look, take a moment if you're not already familiar with the China-made research project out of Boulder, Colorado. Please take a look at the ARI website for details of next week's event. I'm not going to say very much. I'll just very briefly say a few words about the rationale and introduce the three of us whose idea it was to put this together with help from ARI. I'm James Sidaway, Professor of Political Geography here in the Geography Department at the National University of Singapore. Our co-conveners, who I think everyone can see actually on the banner, are Shaun Lin, who's a Max Weber Research Fellow located within the Department of Geography as part of the Max Weber Research Group that I just mentioned. And Naoko Shimazu, who's also a member of the Max Weber Research Group, but is based both in the Asia Research Institute and at Yale NUS. So those are the three of us. Just a very few words about why we decided to do this. I mean, we were stimulated by the fact that the China-made workshop was happening next week and saw the opportunity. So thanks to the team of China-made for welcoming this prequel roundtable. But the motivation was really this. I can't remember where I first heard of Belt and Road. I can't remember exactly where I was. But I can say that around 18 months ago, I started to lose track. And remember, I don't read many languages, yeah, especially Asian languages. The other languages, I read are European languages. And, reading the literature in English and talking to colleagues who work through the literature in Chinese, a couple of years ago, it started to become wholly unmanageable, I felt. So vast, so sprawling, so much, and yet so much of it was saying broadly the same kinds of things. Without going into details here, you can kind of slot the literature into one of, around 5 different strands: geopolitics, geoeconomics, China strategy, so on. What there's less of, although it's starting to happen, and we see this event as one of a step in that direction, is reflection not on what is Belt and Road or how to theorize Belt and Road, but what Belt and Road represents, how we can think through and from Belt and Road in terms of broader theoretical implications and reflections. And this commitment articulates with a wider post-colonial or decolonial move to think through and from Asia and other sites beyond the West as points and modes of theoretical articulation. Yeah? So there's a whole literature on Asia method, for example, which is part of the backdrop to this frame. So that's very much the agenda that we've asked our panelists to speak to. Each will have up to 10 minutes, and I'm going to pass in a moment to Shaun Lin, who's going to look after the chairing of the event. At the end, Naoko will come in with some closing reflections. We've asked each panelist to speak for no more than 10 minutes, and we'll run them back to back in the order that they appear on the banner for the event. So it's alphabetical by family name. And just before I stop, I'll say one other thing is that the set of essays, or rather the essays that will come from today's reflections, relatively short essays, we're planning with agreement from the journal Asia Pacific Viewpoint to assemble that set of relatively short essays for publication there, and we're hoping to do that fairly rapidly, the essays being relatively short. So keep an eye out down the line for that publication in Asia Pacific Viewpoint. I will hand over now to my colleague Shaun Lin with a welcome to everyone wherever you are. Thank you.
All right, thank you, James. Right, a very good morning to the Asian audience and good evening over to the North American audience. Yeah, so welcome to this roundtable discussion on BRI as method forging theoretical agendas. So today we have 6 speakers. As James mentioned, we'll go by alphabetical order. So first we have Tim Banner, and then Darren Byler, Yan Chong, Timothy Oakes, Wu Qiyuan, and Yang. And each speaker will speak for 10 minutes, and then we would have 30 minutes for Q&A. So to everyone as part of the audience, if you would like to raise your questions to a panelist or to several panelists, please type in the chat box to everyone, and I will ask the question on your behalf. Please also identify yourself and your institution. Thank you. So we'll kick off with Tim Banner.
Okay, thanks, Shaun. Thanks, James. Hi, everyone. I'm going to move swiftly into my my remarks because I'm going to struggle to contain within 10 minutes. My starting point is that there's been a recent surge of interest in the BRI as urban, or in terms of the urban question. That's partly because some of the developments carried out in the name of the BRI have manifested in cities as the conventional site of all things urban, but partly also because transdisciplinary urban studies increasingly considers infrastructure and so-called operational landscapes well beyond cities and suburbs in terms of extended or even planetary urbanization. Now, those 2 senses of BRI as urban can each be mapped as different urban geographies, one comprised of a series of city sites, the other tracing networks and extended territorial reach. And of course, those 2 heuristically distinct sets of geographies can be and frequently have been combined cartographically to show BRI encompassing both cities as nodes in networks and as vast expanses of land and seas in between. So my paper is about the implications of such metageographical framings of BRI rather, for doing urban studies, especially in relation to the resurgence of comparative urban scholarship that began before the launch of the BRI. So for the benefit of those of you who don't have a background in urban studies, and with apologies to those of you who do, where I'm coming from here is a couple of intertwined sets of developments and growing sensibilities in that field. The first, going back the best part of 2 decades now, has to do with calls to post-colonialize urban studies and the geography of urban theory, unsettling models and normative generalizations based on supposedly prototypical cities and associated transitions in the West, and troubling ingrained presumptions of the need for a categorical partition between leading edge modern cities, mostly in Europe and North America on the one hand, versus developmentally lacking cities in many other regions on the other. The second set of recent developments in the field concerns both a reinvigoration and diversification of comparative approaches, resisting the default temptation to refer back to canonical comparative reference points in the West, bringing new cities into comparative relation with each other, and even considering relations themselves as part of the object of comparative analysis. And I think working in planetary urbanization has been a real shot in the arm for the last of those in drawing attention to units of comparison beyond the city. Anyway, so how does BRI relate to these scholarly shifts in the field of urban studies? In short, BRI brings a whole range of places and non-place-based infrastructural developments into comparative relation. In some cases, that's through cities that would previously have been studied separately, becoming connected to each other materially or imaginatively. In other cases, cities or operational landscapes that aren't connected through the BRI are brought into previously unthinkable common frames for comparison. And an even broader level of framing, simply being part of the same imagined geography of the BRI, is a spur for thinking about and examining sites and landscapes as part of intertwined but also geographically variable processes of urbanization. All right, so that's a highly generalized global urban studies take on things. But when we focus down a bit, as we're supposed to be doing in the lead up to the China-made event for next week, which focuses on Southeast Asia, I do think that the comparative urban possibilities of BRI also have critical resonances for area studies. So in Southeast Asian studies, for example, a national scale partitioning of training and expertise has long been recognized. And to the extent that that has resulted in nationally siloed frames of analysis, much area studies scholarship on Southeast Asia has been as guilty of methodological nationalism as disciplinary work in the social sciences. The example that I always like to raise here is Lim Heng Kao's book from 1978 on the Malayan urban system. It's an authoritative historical study of how the main settlements in what is today Peninsular Malaysia came to form part of an interconnected system. But precisely because its taken for granted starting point is a national frame of analysis, the book makes very little mention of vital linkages with anywhere else, either in neighboring parts of Southeast Asia or further afield. By the time I started my doctoral work in Malaysia in the 1990s, the rise of work on globalization, on global cities, on more than national connections between urban regions, made the kind of work that Lim did seem rather outdated. But increasingly global urban development-oriented scholarship was problematic in different ways. The models here, for both city builders and city theorists, were almost always in the West. London, New York as global cities, Los Angeles in terms of postmodern urbanism. My own doctoral research was kind of contextual, case study based in Malaysia and not explicitly comparative. But to the extent that there was implicit comparison, it was largely to antecedent cases and conceptualization based on Euro-American cities and urban regions. So mea culpa, right? Now, as many of you are well aware, and James already mentioned this, one of the most powerful critiques of these kinds of tendencies in scholarship on Asia is Chen Quan-Sing's book, Asia as Method. I drew upon Asia as method in developing what is today ARI's Asian Urbanisms cluster, in part because Chen cites an urban studies example. In Chen's geocolonial critique of urban studies work on Los Angeles, he asks, what differences might have been produced had the reference points of postmodern urban space been Asian cities rather than LA? More widely, the question is, why continue to frame work on Asian cities in relation to the traditional Western heartlands of knowledge production rather than in relation to elsewhere in Asia? And of course, that finds expression not just in Asia as Method, the book, but also in the wider inter-Asia cultural studies approach that Chen and others have developed and driven. So returning to the BRI and to the organizing device for today's discussion, what does all this mean for BRI as method and for BRI as urban method in particular? I certainly think that BRI as meta-level imaginary provides opportunities and reasons for scholars and others to bring seemingly disparate places into a shared frame of reference. At some level, the very existence of this discussion today and the larger China-Made conference next week are evidence for that. Whether this means, though, that national level silos are being challenged any more than they would be at any other ARI conference, I'm less certain about. As Williams and colleagues point out in one of the readings that was cited in the framing for this workshop today, they point out that the preponderance of geopolitical approaches to BRI mean that a lot of work has been on nationally framed impacts and responses. But urban studies has to be amongst one of the fields most readily disposed to consider BRI in more relational comparative ways, especially those strands of urban studies now attending to urbanization in its more than city, spatially extended forms. And of course, because the urban question here is so obviously bound up with China's geoeconomic expansion, there is at the very least less of a tendency to anchor work back to Western cities that have been so central to established geographies of urban theory. Finally, while this could foment a flowering of inter-Asia urban studies, I'd want us also to think critically about any continental delimitation of inter-Asia. It's great that this imaginary forces us to think comparatively beyond national containers and methodological nationalism, but to what extent does inter-Asia upscale us to methodological regionalism or methodological continentalism? There's potential for BRI as method to foment forms of comparativism that are not just transnational and inter-Asia, but trans-regional and about urban Asia's place in much wider worlds. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tim, for your contribution. Interesting take on BRI as urban method. Next, we would move to Darren Byler. Over to you, Darren.
Oh, great. It's an honor to be here. What I'm going to do in my 10 minutes is try to theorize the BRI from below, or from the perspective of receiving communities at a sort of subnational level. And to do this, I'm going to borrow some thinking from a few of the contributors to the China Made workshop next week. So you can consider this a kind of teaser for what's to come. So to start this story, I want to go back to the 1960s, which is when, in many cases, the Third World was viewed as a site of decolonial liberation, or as the site of post-colonialism being realized. At least from the perspective of Western scholarship. There's exceptions to the story, and I'm speaking in pretty broad strokes, but this is sort of what was happening in the 60s and 70s. By the 1980s, the Third World, or what eventually came to be known as the Global South, became thought of more as a site of despotic leadership, of democratic projects gone awry, and as the site of human rights. This is where human rights crises happen. And as that discourse took hold, and for good reason, I mean, human rights is something that I also believe in, what happened along the way was a stripping of political agency in subnational communities, especially those that are the focus of human rights issues. It was a placing of them in the sort of victim slot, a suffering slot. China itself has often been regarded in similar ways, a site of despotic leadership and of human rights crises, particularly after 1989. But at the same time, it was becoming a developmental state that really was unlike other global South nations, at least in terms of its scale and eventually its economy. One of the contributors to our workshop next week, Zishan Liu, points out that state-owned enterprises led the way in this regard, really opening up the Chinese economy to an export-oriented orientation. And at the same time, or over time, beginning an infrastructure development push within China itself. And really infrastructure development became the driver of the Chinese economy. Zishan shows in his paper that at the same time as all of this is going on, low-level bureaucrats and workers within this system were also fostering a black market economy that funneled building materials into personal and community projects that sort of help them to solidify their own community standing and reproduce it at a subnational level, even as the Chinese state, which is an authoritarian state, really controlled much of the economy. There was this space at the margins. By 2010, the 2010s in the Xi administration, a new political platform came into sort of the focus, which was, before the BRI, the China Dream. I was in China at the time, and this China Dream discourse was everywhere. And so I was asking the people in my community, what does this mean? Because it's a pretty vague concept. It seemed like it was a derivation of American Dream, but I wasn't sure. And so one of the people I was interviewing told me that for him, and he was sort of joking as he said this, the China Dream is having a Japanese wife, Korean children, a German car, and an American house. And he was joking, but at the same time, there was some truth in what he was saying. What he was really doing was he was sort of reproducing a masculinist, patriarchal ideal for himself as the center of the Chinese Dream, one that would help him to reproduce himself, even as he was taking on these different elements from other places. It was sort of a comparative exercise from his perspective. So in the China Dream, there's this way of reproducing yourself. So does that dream travel? As the BRI took focus and became this rubric for the economy in China, there's a question that opens up, does this dream travel to other places? And I'm going to answer sort of yes and no. Initially, the BRI was really focused on hard infrastructure, on dams and roads and that sort of thing. But by 2016 or so, it started to shift to digital infrastructure, to smartphones, to 3G internet access, to GPS tracking, to supply chain logistics, to financial technologies, those sorts of things. And another one of our contributors next week, Simon Roeder, who's here, I think, in the audience, shows us that in northern Laos, new material interconnections brought folks in that community in contact with the Chinese Dream. They started to think about the possibilities that were open to them beyond Confucius institutes and other kinds of soft power. It was more about economic and cultural opportunities on the other side or on both sides of the border. And Simon shows in his work that Lao folks at the borderland began to emphasize their smallness, their inconsequentiality, their strategic invisibility, which allowed them to travel in non-threatening ways across the border and really sort of develop sort of flexible forms of community and relations. They're strategic in how they use social media. They use Facebook and WhatsApp for Lao social networking and WeChat for communication with their Chinese business partners. So they're developing a kind of flexible citizenship across borders. The local communities, in fact, are using Chinese investments to their own advantage. And this is something that echoes across space as across the BRI in many different contexts. And I really can't get into a bunch of different examples, but this is the sort of thing that I'm thinking about. Sovereignty defined as the ability to autonomously reproduce the world of a community is being performed here in flexible ways. Of course, over time, as technologies become embedded in daily life, we do start to see shifts in social organization and cohesion. Media dependency theory suggests that as media eats into social life, it starts to throw forms of autonomy into question. And this is particularly the case if a group is targeted by state power. As in my case, I work with Uyghurs in Northwest China, and that's what's happened to them. But in other contexts where sovereignty is more flexible and is protected by another nation state from the Chinese state power, I think that there's still a lot of room. My sense is that the real contest between Chinese and Euro-American spheres of influence will play out in digital infrastructure. So far, the Western model is really leading in this regard. Facebook and WhatsApp are the internet throughout Southeast Asia and most of the global South. But I think there is potential for WeChat to catch up. So we'll have to see how these things play out over time. Once Taobao and Alibaba become the primary way that people consume products and WeChat becomes their primary source of news, subnational forms of autonomy may face greater threat. All right, I'll start to wrap up here. What does it mean to theorize the BRI from below? The BRI, viewed from the perspective of receiving communities, offers new ways of theorizing subnational forms of sovereignty. It's a site of flexible autonomy, at least in the short term. BRI as method could allow scholars to reconceptualize the human rights slot, to think beyond microfinancing and poverty alleviation, and instead to think about how these systems are articulated to global capitalism and to global power in different ways. So I'd like to see scholars utilize the BRI frame to think about the rough ground, the site of practice, where forces of global capitalism collide and build new infrastructures of connection, produce new forms of relational autonomy in the spaces in between. Centering study of the BRI in the lived experience of receiving communities shows us how global economic systems are lived in articulation with global history. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Darren, for your contribution. Right, BRI, to take note of the communities, the voices from below. So next we would have Yan Chong from NUS. Over to you, Yan.
All right, thank you, Shaun. Thank you, James, for putting this together and for inviting me. So let me begin by sort of offering a slight contrast to James. I actually do remember exactly where and when I had come across the BRI, or its initial term, the One Belt, One Road. So this was about 2015. There was an event that some Chinese scholars had organized in Singapore. And this was to push out the One Belt, One Road that earlier Xi Jinping had announced. So not knowing really what the details were, I was very curious. I went to this event. And to be honest, came out none the wiser, with the exception of sort of knowing that there was a big sort of interest in infrastructure. And infrastructure in the sort of colossal material, physical sense, right? Dams, railroads, roads, so on and so forth, and ports, of course. So what got me thinking from this sort of initial meeting is that the BRI, to me, sounds remarkably similar to a number of other sort of major power projects that we've seen in the past, whether this was the sort of infrastructure projects that came out of Soviet-American competition during the Cold War, or whether it was various colonial projects associated with, say, the British or the French, and so on and so forth. So I guess the question for me then was, what does the BRI actually tell us about major powers? What does it tell us about the way that major powers envision the world? The way that they, seem to be repeating similar kinds of action across time, right? Of course, there's this question of power and how to use it and how to expand influence across time and space. So on the one hand, I think one of the things that the BRI sort of suggested to me is beyond this sort of idea of isomorphism, right? Major powers will do what major powers do. I think it breaks down initially some of this idea that the use of power, that colonialism or colonial-like actions, and also the sort of externalities that follow the environmental social impact is necessarily sort of Euro-American or Japanese, right? Any actor who amasses sufficient wealth and uses it to sort of uses that wealth to then expand its influence across time and space, seems to have a very similar feel in terms of what they want to do in terms of setting up connections. And I think the step beyond that, right, for me at least, is that it's not just the stuff, the physical stuff that gets built that really matters. I think what is key here is to remember what the BRI brings is a set of institutions, as a set of ways of doing things, and institutions in both the formal and informal sense. So, following the infrastructure, there's of course infrastructure financing, right? So we have things like the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. This sets up certain. It's a formal institution. It sets up certain modes of financing. It sets up certain vehicles for moving capital around. And in a way, whether this was planned or not, right, it does present an alternative to the sort of American established order that had come up after the Second World War with the World Bank, the IMF, and then the extensions through the ADB and things like that. So there are these formal institutions that seem to offer another option. Related to that, of course, is when you think about any major project that involves a lot of money, there will be disputes. And these things are common. It's not, particularly sort of unique to the BRI or the PRC, but there needs to be a way to resolve these disputes. So what we've seen, of course, with the BRI are the arbitral courts, essentially, that the PRC has set up, right, located in Shanghai and Beijing. And what this these sets of dispute resolution mechanisms do is that, again, they present an alternative to the WTO and other approaches for dispute resolution that we're familiar with, often based off of the common law system, right? So in essence, this is a sort of export, right, of PRC. I wouldn't say Chinese, because I think the PRC is very historically rooted in very particular kinds of practices. A PRC stamp, right, on an alternative way of approaching things like disputes when you get into these big infrastructure projects. So these are the sort of formal institutions that are in place. Darren had earlier talked about the digital infrastructure, and I think this is where some of the more informal kinds of institutionalization also starts appearing. So when we talk about infrastructure, even the physical stuff, right? We're talking about certain technical specifications, like railroad gauges and things like that, that once you have the infrastructure built in, there's a sunk cost that you need to sort of follow, these technical specifications, or else you would have to sort of replace them at great cost, or if you mix them up, there could be a lot of potential confusion. So think about why we drive on the right side of the why drivers sit on the right side of the vehicle and drive on the left side of the road in Singapore, and in the US, the drivers sit on the left side and drive on the right side of the road. I mean, this is the sort of, in a very crude way, the specifications that are in place. So this too extends to the digital infrastructure, the different kinds of technical specifications. So some of the US China tech war stuff that's going on now has to do with specifications, to do with privacy, to do with surveillance, to do with regulation of tech companies, what tech companies can and cannot do, what they can and cannot collect. So in this respect, while there's no sort of formal court or development bank built around these sorts of infrastructures, these sorts of regulations and specifications, what they do though is set up certain path dependencies, right, for the various places that decide to plug in to BRI, that will close off certain options, and possibly making others more costly, while at the same time opening up still other kind of options and making them perhaps more attractive. So in a sense then, what the BRI is doing, like I suppose some of the sort of earlier projects that we've seen, is to set up a perhaps divergence in the sort of world order that we've become quite familiar with, certainly after the Second World War and definitely after the Cold War. So I suppose for me, looking at the sort of from a sort of very macro perspective, in contrast to Darren's ground up perspective, I think where the BRI comes in is that it sets up a juncture, right? Especially as US-China friction gets more intense, that we'll see more competing institutions that perhaps leads to a change in the direction in which sort of global order or institutional architecture might be going. Whereas really since the Cold War, there's been quite a lot of convergence. We may be seeing a sort of inflection point where that integration may be going on two sort of separate and parallel paths, and in a way that almost reflects some of those sort of older dynamics we saw during the later 20th century and the sort of projects that came before. So I guess for me, theorizing about the BRI is a way of thinking about how global order gets shaped, how it gets evolved going forward. And it also is also a reminder, I suppose, to me, at least, for those sort of not just nationalist-oriented projects, but regionally oriented projects like, say, Asia's Method, that sometimes it's also good to see how, or good to understand, right, how actors may have points of commonality. It's not that if you're located in Asia, you're immune to the sort of temptations of power. You could be as well. They may manifest in different ways. But to think about those sorts of comparisons, I think it would be, for me at least, a really productive way of thinking about what the BRI opens up as in terms of pushing forward theoretical inquiry. All right, so I'm at about 10 minutes. I'll end there, and I'd be happy to continue this conversation later on during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Ian, for taking us through a macro perspective. So now we have Tim Oaks from Boulder. Over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Shaun, and thanks, James and Naoko, for organizing this. It's a great prequel warm up to the workshop next week, but also a really important issue to just tackle on its own terms as well. So I'm really happy to be part of it. I wrote up a few notes to keep myself on track. I'm not, we'll see if I get through them all. Shaun, if I start to just kind of go on, just jump in and tell me to wrap up. So I'm going to start by kind of returning to something that James mentioned right at the beginning in terms of the different kinds of kind of conventional accounts of the BRI. Just to start with the observation that a great deal of journalistic and popular media accounts, and not a small amount of scholarship as well, about the BRI assume a relatively conventional approach to politics and political power. And this approach is one where power originates in the authority of the party state, and more specifically, the central party state in Beijing, personified in the figure of Xi Jinping. Policy initiatives like the BRI then become extensions of this power, diffusing out over the land, and their extension a measure of just how powerful the party state really is, or at least how powerful we might imagine it to be. And there are numerous narrative pathways that this conventional approach takes, and some of these are celebratory, in which we have a China model of development that is infrastructure heavy, that is fast and cheap, that involves win-win transactions, house support, no strings attached financing, and so on, where you see a return to building the hardware of development while the West has shifted to its focus more to software. But other narrative accounts are more sinister, raising ideas of debt trap diplomacy and the rise of neocolonialism, enclave models with few linkages to local economies, using infrastructure diplomacy to secure access to resources, or political commitments to support China's positions, and so on and so forth. So the issue here is not simply the mythical nature of these narratives, and they are largely mythical, but also the way they attribute geopolitical intentionality to China's international activities. And this is not to say that actors in Beijing or elsewhere in China do not put China's geopolitical priorities at the forefront of their thinking about the BRI. As C.K. Lee has argued, Chinese state capital is a different kind of capital in which profit maximization is less the objective than what she calls encompassing accumulation, in which profit is defined in multidimensional terms, including political influence and access to commodities, along with financial gains, of course. But the idea that Chinese development projects abroad are policy extensions emanating from Beijing is difficult to support empirically. And there are several reasons for this. One is that the primary instrument of internationalization in China is not so much geopolitical as it is geoeconomic, or more precisely, the state-owned enterprise is the main actor. And as Ruben Gonzalez Vicente has argued, when acting through state-owned enterprises, state power becomes embedded in business ventures and is subsequently dispersed and dislocated. So the re-territorialization of the Chinese state outside of China is therefore, he argues, a decentered process involving diverse entities with different strategies, objectives, and behaviors. Another reason that it is problematic to understand Chinese development projects as geopolitical policy extensions emanating from Beijing could be that much of global China has emerged in response to domestic crises in political economy. China's, that is domestic Chinese crises. China's going out strategy can be thought of as part of a domestic restructuring process, outsourcing key aspects of production, labor activities, investment, and so on. So given these kind of conventional narrative pathways that I guess I'm suggesting we might want to avoid, how might we want to look at these projects? So in various writings and talks, I've been suggesting a techno-political approach to China's infrastructure investment projects in which infrastructures themselves become the units of analysis. And this is because I've found that much of the work done on these projects does not really pay much attention to the infrastructures themselves, but rather assigns them a typically passive role in a narrative that is driven by conventional geopolitics. So there's a broad range of analytical approaches that we might list under this category of technopolitics. The most straightforward would be technical projects that are developed with political objectives in mind. Territorial integration, integrity, and security figure prominently here, as do the political dividends gained from the economic outcomes of technical projects. So this approach might be more directly relevant. This kind of more straightforward approach to technopolitics might be more directly relevant to technical projects within China or along China's borderlands, connective infrastructures in Tibet and Xinjiang, technological developments in the South China Sea and those kinds of things. But I'm actually more interested in thinking about technopolitics through the theoretical genealogies that underlie these approaches. That is, the materialist ontology that animates the technical as an assemblage of relations among human and non-human entities. And so from this perspective, technopolitics speaks to the political effects of those material assemblages. And it speaks to the ways those political effects are recycled back into the technical forms of the project as they continue to develop or expand over time. So just a really quick illustration of some of these ideas in some of the work that's been done out there by other people, with apologies to Tom Goodfellow and Huang Zhengli for oversimplifying their case study on the Addis Ababa light rail project. But this is a project that has been narrated through a conventional political framework, a debt trap project, a Chinese project that is not integrated with the local economy, doesn't fit local needs, an extension of Chinese power into Ethiopia. But the material and technical details of the project suggest a more compelling explanation for the project's controversial nature. That explanation includes the fact that it is a rail line being built on what was originally supposed to be a bus transit system. Institutional gaps between national and local planning authorities ensured that the project would be built in a highly fragmented way. The financial model for the project was a complete failure, being based on the kind of transit-based development that went on in Hong Kong and Shenzhen. And the power demands of running the new system exceeded the city's generating capacity, causing the city government to disown it and freeze any further extensions of the project. Meanwhile, though, the existing line that was built took on a life of its own among city dwellers. Most of the users were not middle-class commuters that were envisioned by the government, but rather working-class people accessing services in the city center. Goodfellow and Huang write, quote, instead of being a commuting option for the burgeoning middle classes, it has been appropriated by lower income groups as an occasional, useful, and cheap means of accessing urban life. Qualitative responses strongly indicate that people value the sense of alternatives the LRT provides, as well as its modernity and connectivity to the city. Despite its non-integration into the city's broader transport networks, it may therefore be considered a success politically, end of quote. So this is a political success that was haphazard, unplanned, and unintended. It's a political effect of the project as a socio-technical assemblage rather than the outcome of Beijing's strategic designs in Africa. And so to kind of then wrap this up and extend out from that example, I think the BRI offers opportunities to shift the narrative away from conventional approaches to politics and political power. That shift means focusing less on the geopolitical intentions that are thought to drive Chinese projects abroad and more on the actual political effects of those projects on the ground. Sometimes those effects align with the hopes or intentions of strategists in Beijing or of the heads of Chinese state-owned enterprises, but just as often they do not align, but rather establish new conditions on the ground around which those strategists or company heads must rethink their development approach. And so a project-based research agenda exploring technopolitical effects of those projects is ultimately an agenda committed to the evolutionary nature of the BRI. It's not a snapshot. I guess you can think of it as not really a snapshot approach so much as a dialectical one. And if I have another minute, I'll just add a couple more thoughts about the question of power. And you know, so what I'm trying to suggest here, and most of you will have probably already picked up on this, is a more relational notion of power that derives, we could say, from Foucault's conception of the apparatus, the dispositif, which is a heterogeneous ensemble of diverse elements consisting of all sorts of things. And in this approach, the interaction among those elements, both material and immaterial, human and non-human, is where power is constituted. This is an ontologically flat notion of power, or at least a flatter one than the one in which power is assumed to emanate from authorities in Beijing. And so I think the BRI offers an opportunity to explore this more relational notion of power through this kind of technopolitical focus on the projects themselves. So I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Tim. So urging us not just to look at the geopolitical intention, but also the effects on the ground. So before I get Dr. Wen Chuan to speak, I'll just mention a bit about the questions. So if you have any questions for the panelists, please type them in the chat box and I will ask on your behalf. Thank you. So now over to Chuan from NUS Geography.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Good morning. So first of all, many thanks to James, Naoko, and Shaun for inviting me to participate in this wonderful event. So I don't have much time, so I'll dive straight into a brief reflection of the theme of the workshop before foregrounding two intellectual directions that I hope to develop for BRI research in relation to the theme. So in the expositions of Asia as method, Yoshimi Taguchi and later Chen Guanxing actually foreground how the psychological adherence to the so-called West has been present in Asian history as a conscious and unconscious response to modernity. And the imbalance or unequal nature of East-West relations is, according to Taguchi and Chen, intimately connected with the question of hegemony within the East. Hence, for Taguchi, right, the lack of bidirectional cultural influence is the main problem facing East-West relations, and Asia as method involves a rollback for culture for the so-called Orient to embrace and change the West. Alternatively, Chen actually insists on the process of interreferencing within Asia to multiply the frames of reference in our subjectivity and worldview so that existing anxieties over the West can actually be diluted. Despite differing in what they actually mean by Asia as method, both Taguchi and Chen's work demonstrate an affinity with other efforts to multiply the size of theory, to destabilize geopolitical dominance, and to express subaltern and previously subjugated knowledges. So adapting all these formulations to the theme of this workshop, how can BRI as method then contribute to theory making and the decolonization and diversification of knowledges? And to really answer this question, I turn to China as a site of reference, essentially to trace and critically scrutinize emerging Chinese discourses and debates about the BRI. And I think this will in turn allow me to elucidate how all these recent Chinese ideas and narratives associated with the BRI are critical resources for us to rethink and reframe wider theoretical explications, specifically relating to diplomacy, infrastructure, and digital sovereignty. And I think this intellectual exercise is also very useful, given that the BRI was first formally announced in 2013 by the Chinese government, and it will actually be a good time to take stock of the changing Chinese narratives about the BRI and reflect on its wider implications and consequences. So the first discourse I want to actually focus on is how the BRI has increasingly been viewed through the lens of diplomacy. And I think this is very much related to how the Chinese state has actually conceived of the BRI as a pathway to enact the country's mantra of major country diplomacy with Chinese characteristics. So in the forthcoming paper, a colleague and I have argued how this discourse actually helps to cast like a more relational understandings of diplomacy. Specifically, we contend that such contemporary expositions of Chinese diplomacy are actually underpinned by different webs of relationality. So on the one hand, it seems that China's postulation of its unique value of win-win cooperation actually imply a condition of what some scholars have called ethical relationalism, with China and its diplomatic partners being bounded together in a relationship that is defined by mutuality, symmetry, harmony, and equality. However, I think China's self-professed positionality as a major country evokes a fundamentally hierarchical worldview where there actually exists minor and peripheral sort of states that implicitly hold less influence and weight in their wider diplomatic engagements and responsibilities. All right, and I think this relational contradiction in Chinese diplomacy can in turn help to review certain spatial tensions when the BRI is being operationalized at different sites at scale. And one spatial tension I want to focus on here revolves around whether the BRI actually constitutes a win-win diplomacy for a harmonious world or whether it's really about extractive or coercive territorially based diplomacy. So for instance, although China's policy directives pertaining to win-win cooperation may be much more visible at the economic front, it is much more difficult to realize them in the security domains, given that issues such as territorial or maritime disputes tend to be zero-sum in nature. Relatedly, it can also be argued that Xi Jinping has displayed little innovative diplomatic thinking with regard to concerns that revolve around China's sovereign and territorial integrity. Indeed, Xi Jinping has turned out to be much more resolute and assertive in defending perceived core national interests due to his understanding of China's significantly enhanced geopolitical power. And this has widely been referred to as the principal bottom line of Xi's new diplomatic approach, where China is purported to never relinquish its legitimate security and developmental rights. So more often than not in the general literatures, China's aggressive military actions in the South China Sea are being cast as being contradictory to its projected goal of harnessing a harmonious world through its major country diplomacy sort of campaigns. All right, so I think this induces sort of tensions given that China is constantly trying to negotiate between a broader notion of a state that stresses national territorial integrity and also a civilizational state that accentuates cultural and infrastructural connections and affiliations. So the question I want to pose to, I guess, the floor here is, how would this sort of Chinese state resolve such a tension in order to shape broader imaginings of the benign sort of effects of the BRI and induce buy-ins to the country's new thought and diplomacy itself? And I think the lens of diplomacy can also afford us with another very fruitful intellectual inquiry, that is to critically examine the ever-growing number of descriptors, right, emerging from both within and outside of China that has been attached to this term diplomacy in order to characterize the BRI. So I'm sure many of you would have heard about the BRI being discussed in terms of peripheral diplomacy, infrastructure diplomacy, tourism diplomacy, diaspora diplomacy, and the list actually goes on. But I guess the question we need to ask ourselves here includes, how do these different forms of diplomacy intersect and relate to one another? When operationalized on the ground, how different and unique are all these Chinese diplomacies from existing conceptualizations of diplomacy? So for instance, there have been claims that infrastructural diplomacy is essentially a variant of trade diplomacy. And a growing number of subnational actors involved in the forging of BRI partnerships can be seen as forms of para-diplomacy. So I think all these questions should lead us to reflect on the extent in which the BRI is indeed fostering a distinct Chinese diplomatic culture here. The second discourse I want to briefly reflect on here, right, has been discussed by Darren and also by Yen here, is the increasing discussion within China's academic and policy realms about the digital Silk Road. I think in particular, right, there are claims that with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, has severely delayed the progress of physical infrastructural projects under the BRI. Hence, the digital Silk Road, according to some Chinese scholars, can potentially be BRI 2.0 to move the BRI into the next stage of development and promote what one Chinese scholar actually calls an internet-enabled inclusive globalization. So in essence, right, the digital Silk Road sees China incorporating telecoms, media, and technology to develop the BRI more effectively and sustainably across different parts of the world. So I think China has started building submarine and terrestrial optic cables and data centers, as well as encouraging countries along the BRI to use its Beidou satellite system. But the Chinese government also understands that an internet-enabled inclusive globalization cannot occur without coming up with new digital standards, regimes, and norms. That is why Beijing has announced what it calls China's Standards 2035, which is essentially a 15-year blueprint that aspires to set global standards for the next generation of technologies, including 5G, artificial intelligence, and the Internet of Things. All right, and I think these developments raises all kinds of interesting conceptual questions, including those relating to the critical interface between BRI and infrastructure. So as discussed by the earlier panelists, most BRI research has tended to focus on the role of physical surface infrastructures, such as ports and railways, in facilitating connections and interactions. However, the digital Silk Road forces us to reconceptualize BRI infrastructures in terms of their volumetric, subterranean, and digital dimensions. All right. Indeed, how do we actually make sense of the progression and success of the digital Silk Road if digital infrastructures are largely underground and hidden from sight? And what sorts of digital imaginations are being shot up? And what other kinds of subterranean knowledges are being suppressed and displaced from sight? And with China establishing standards and norms for the use of its digital infrastructures, what would that actually mean for debates around digital sovereignty, power, and governance? Arguably, it is easier for countries to pull out of physical infrastructure projects in partnership with China, as opposed to opting out of certain digital norms and governance regime once they have actually signed up to them. All right, and I think this will also redefine notions of cyber warfare and cybersecurity for many so-called Western states, especially if they are forced to confront alternative digital models, regulations, and norms on the global stage. All right, so to really conclude, right, even though I focus on emerging Chinese sort of narratives and discourses related to the BRI here, I'm definitely not trying to use such BRI analyses as a pathway towards initiating Sinocentrism. Rather, what I've done here, right, is perhaps to provincialize the BRI, to borrow Dipesh Chakrabarty's sort of term here, right, so as to discuss wider theoretical debates and putting them into dialogue with the development of BRI narratives within China. But for the BRI to really contribute to a much more cosmopolitan yet situated world of theory, there is perhaps a need for the proliferation of more reference points to study the BRI, such that different voices and subjectivities can actually coexist in the ongoing and unfinished project of reconstituting and also rethinking of the BRI. Hence, I think, collaborative sort of research ventures and productive dialogues between scholars from different parts of the world on the topic of BRI are really important if we are to produce much more robust understandings of the BRI, as well as to realize the full potential of BRI as method. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you, Chia, for your fascinating talk on diplomacy and also the digital landscapes of a BRI and some of the difficulties that could be raised in presently and in the future. Last, we have Yang from BRI. So over to you, Yang.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen and okay. Okay. Well, don't worry, I'm not going to cover everything because that's a lot. So so again, thank you, Shaun, James, and Naoko for having me to be part of the panel. Okay, to be part of the panel. So the good thing about being the last person to present is that actually a lot of the themes that in my slides are already covered by other discussants. So I'm not going to go into details about those topics. But what I'm going to do is to look at BRI as a multiple geography of knowledge production, specifically to look into how different academic spaces are constructed within and outside China in the context of the BRI. So one of the anecdote that I would like to share, which is actually part of the anecdote that recently I had, was my mom. So my mother she's an academic based in China. And then I mentioned to her that, oh, I'm going to be part of this BRI panel discussion. She paused it for a while and said, why are you still doing BRI? It's still 2017. I was a bit shocked, in not just because she wasn't too encouraging as to say like, oh, good for you, good luck with the panel discussion, but it was her very particular comment that it was so 2017, which actually reflect this kind of a disjunction between the pace of academic interest in China and outside. Because look at us, a lot of us, we're still doing BRI related research, and then we're still applying for grants that are specifically associated with BRI projects, and then looking at BRIs. But for Chinese academics like my mother, she seems to be already moving on from the BRI to somewhere else. And also, I would like to echo what James earlier mentioned about the kind of sameness of the Chinese language journal article that are talking about the BRI, because they seems to be all very commentary, and then they also touch on maybe 5 or 6 generic issues such as infrastructure, or let's say policy making related comments. So those things, as James mentioned earlier, is that could be, individuals' language ability, especially how well you can engage academic Chinese, and also your own political positions. So that can also lead to one of the observations I found is that a lot of the Chinese language publications, these references normally go into the background section of a lot of the non-Chinese language publications. Given my limited language ability, I would just use English language publication as an example. However, vice versa, a lot of the English language publications, especially those that are not published by scholars that are based in China, those references also go into their background section, which without any in-depth engagement, only in a section that is started with scholars in foreign countries study BRI in such and such ways. So instead of only thinking about, oh, what's happening, it seems that these two parts of the academia do not talk. What's going on here? I like to think about how and what caused these disjunction and what produced these two very particular academic spaces. So what I'm going to do in the following 10 minutes is to look at the funding sources and the research outputs as the two key aspects of the academic space in China. So first of all, let's look at how do you get funding on BRI projects in China. And then, so when we talk about the funding landscape in China, it's kind of similar to other places. So you have two main funding agencies at the national level. which are also directly supervised by the central government, are the National Science Foundation and the National Social Science Fund of China, the NSSFC. So for social science and humanities projects, most funding comes from the latter. The NSSFC can also be seen as an equivalent of the SSRC, the Social Science Research Council in Singapore and the US. And similarly, funding from this source is thought highly of and hence often used as a key indicator or asset in the tenure review processes. So according to the NSSFC grant database, since mid-2014 until 2019, there are more than 600 research proposals approved across different disciplines. Those different disciplines include history, religious studies, management, etc. And one could guess that there are probably even more grants awarded at the lower level by regional governments and the local branches of the NSSFC. Some commonalities that we can observe from those awarded projects include showing these studies' relevance to policymaking and project implementations in a BRI context. For instance, research projects on transnational Buddhist networks between China and elsewhere suggests their fundings being instrumental to cultural exchanges between China and other BRI countries. Another strategy used by applicants is to drop in BRI-related keywords in the titles and other sections of the proposals. For instance, keywords such as BRI-based strategy or in the context or in the backdrop of the BRI, they're frequently included in the proposal titles. These practices, admittedly, are very prevalent in grants application whereby governmental initiatives and campaigns are crucial factors in evaluating the project's timeliness. Some categories of the grants are specifically aligned with new and upcoming policies in terms of deliverables. And second, what do researchers write about respectively? And given the vast number of academic publications on the BRI since 2014, I will not go into publications in all social science fields, but I will primarily focus on human geography, which I'm more familiar with. So according to Liu Weidong and his colleagues, BRI-related publications have mushroomed soon after the Chinese government officially launched the national initiatives. Similar to the general direction given by the funding agencies, journal articles tend to be more generic and commentary, and rather than focusing on one or two small case studies at the local level, which we commonly see in English language publication, many social science papers tend to focus on issues including FDI, infrastructure such as railroads and maritime transport at the macro level. Geographical research, in comparison, focus on China and other BRI countries' geopolitical and economic relations, the strategic implications of infrastructure projects such as Trans-Eurasia logistics and the key trade ports that affect China's maritime transport. And there are also other issues that were also discussed, but less so, for instance, environmental issues and urban development. Given those issues, scholars are also called for engaging the BRI in depth and producing outputs that offer more constructive implications theoretically and empirically. However, we should keep in mind that we need to understand this particular call or statement within the context of making research informative and relevant to policymaking, specifically in BRI-related development. So just to recap my reflections, rather than simply claiming the lack of critical voices in the Chinese language publications on the BRI, it is more productive for us as researchers to think about the politics of shaping academic spaces and different knowledges of the BRI. Of course, my current observations are rather preliminary since these are based on readings a limited number of Chinese language sources. However, I also wonder it might present a rather different dynamics when we examine the Chinese academics English language publication that are more geared towards a different audience. So that's my presentation. Thank you so much.